All right, so welcome everyone. And we are so grateful and excited for this third session of our three-part series, Meeting at the Crossroads of Grief and Trauma Awareness, a psychosocial spiritual approach for service providers in Mi'kma'ki. And I am going to begin with our land acknowledgement, but I want to invite each of you to join us in our land acknowledgement. So please use the chat, as Brian has already done, to introduce yourself and acknowledge the specific land where you are located. I, for example, am actually visiting family outside of Mi'kma'ki right now, but thanks to technology, I'm able to be here. But I am actually located in Shawnee, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Osage land. Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is in Mi'kma'ki, and this is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. Let us take this moment for gratitude for this beautiful land, for the amazingly wise and brave Mi'kmaq leaders and communities who have cared for this land, who continue to care for it, and advocate for it. Please think of the lands, territories, and Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us, individually and as a collective body of social workers, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Wulalu. Thank you all. And as I had shared, I want to just invite us to take a deep breath, exhale out the morning. It's been a Monday morning already for many of us. And just arrive and be centered and let the words that we just shared kind of sit with us. And let us pause in gratitude for those wise elders and Ilnu community leaders who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this land, that we can join them in this work. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our minds and bodies with harmful energy. Let us take this moment to affirm our commitment to join in the important work of decolonization, which has affected so many. Let us take this moment to commit to justice and healing, for colonization is at the root of so much genocide, racism, queerphobia, and injustice here and across the planet. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude, as well as an expression of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and one another. Wulalu. With this, I am going to stop share and invite Kristen to say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that, Anne. I think I needed that kind of step and centering and to cope with the Mondays. So welcome to everybody online. 139 people are taking time out of a busy December morning to join and support in our last of 3 sessions that Tracy, Danielle, Melody, Jolene, and I have dreamed up for about a year. So I just want to take a moment to flip it over to Tracy to say hello. And Tracy, I would love if you could just mention maybe a bit about the journey into how these 3 sessions became alive and how they were brought together, and then maybe after that I'll jump in around some next step kind of pieces before we flip it over to Serena.
Perfect. Welcome, everybody. My name is Tracy Shea, and I'm the coordinator of integrated services for the SchoolsPlus team, and I cover the Northern region. I've had the ongoing privilege of being on a grief journey with Serena for about 8, almost 9 years now. I was a SchoolsPlus facilitator for 8 years, and during that time, I partnered with Serena, recognizing the need to support our youth in the area of grief. So Serena and I have been doing a lot of work in the Northern region. We started with just doing some basic grief education and literacy. The first time we opened up that opportunity for our community here, we had over 100 participants show up to a training out at the Debert Hospitality Center, and we actually turned folks away. So it was then we recognized the need for people to have an opportunity to come together, to explore grief, to talk about their grief, to talk about how to support our families and communities around grief. Serena has helped our team run grief groups at the high school and junior high levels and train up folks in the community. We've always looked at grief as a bit of a double-edged sword. It belongs to everybody, and yet no one funds it. So that has been the vein of our existence for the last 10 years, and for Serena, her whole career of trying to get people. Everybody wants to talk about grief, everybody wants support around grief, but trying to get people to fund it so it's not something we do off the sides of our desk has been a massive challenge for us. So every opportunity we have to do this work, we embrace every opportunity. And I was out walking this morning with my dog and actually reflecting on this journey, Serena, and thinking the tenacity that you have to keep coming back over and over again while we try to secure funding and while we try to make this a priority for our governments and for our teams. Hats off to you, because I think I would have packed it in a long time ago. So we appreciate you and value you and the work that you bring. I would like to acknowledge the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia, who we did receive a large grant from to help us in this work, and partnering with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers and SchoolsPlus. So this is only step 1. Again, I feel like it's step 1 for the 3rd or 4th time, but we continue to try to build literacy across this province and with our teams, and hopefully at some point we will get the funding that this deserves. And that we can keep moving forward in it. So I appreciate everybody continuing to show up and continuing to do this work, because it's difficult and challenging work, especially when it's off the sides of our desks a lot of the time. And hopefully it'll become more of a priority, especially in this province where we've had so much tragedy and grief over the last few years. So I look forward to continuing the journey, Serena, and I appreciate all that you do for us.
Thanks so much, Tracy, and I echo all of the words that she had shared as I introduce you for the 3rd time, Serena, and the phenomenal work that you have done across our province. How many invitations, stretches that I have had personally, professionally, as a reflection of the learning that I have had the opportunity to grow. And then in addition, the phenomenal feedback that we have received across this commitment to exploring grief and loss across the province with the support of the Mental Health Foundation. So with that, I would love to turn it over to our award-winning Serena Lewis, with gratitude and a bit of sadness that this will be the last Monday journey together, but we will definitely continue the conversations. And as Tracy said, our commitment to ensuring that communities and that the helpers get the help that they require to be able to continue to support communities as they deserve. So with that, I'll turn it over to you with my gratitude to everybody online.
Welcome, welcome. I see a raised hand.
No, this is, oh, that's Cheryl. We have one attendee that often has raised hands, but just a reminder to everyone that we are wanting to have everyone use the question and answer at the bottom of your screen for questions, and to use the chat for ways of commenting and joining in the conversation. Okay, no worries, Cheryl. And when you're doing the chat, just make sure you write for everyone if you want to select it for everyone. Otherwise, it defaults to hosts and panelists. But if you have a question that you want us to answer, there's a separate button for that at the bottom of your screen in the middle.
Good morning and thank you. Thank you to everyone. As we get into content today, we're going to talk about co-collaboration and the significance of it. And I really do believe that's what we've all been doing. Oh, I'm glad you like my cup. I think it's really, really important, and just to acknowledge, Tracy, thank you. This has been a very tumultuous journey and probably one that none of us could ever have expected. But what I am always refreshed by is the amount of people through SchoolsPlus, through the College of Social Work, through the Mental Health Foundation, and people who are taking time out of this Monday of Mondays in a mid-December, to attend, but not only to attend, but to actually participate in the way you have been. I am deeply moved by the amount of engagement this way, and I had a benefit of meeting one of you. Actually, I saw you at a coffee shop locally this weekend, and truly appreciate our conversation about this, and recognizing that I wish we were in a room together and that we were having much more levels of dialogue and participation. I always come into the final day with a bit of like anxiousness, so I'm going to be really honest about that. But I also realize that, again, this is the beginning of another step. So I don't look at today as the last step. I look at today as another opportunity for us to continue this dialogue. And as you were speaking, Tracy, I was thinking about this weekend. I had a local reporter call about doing an article on grief and trauma in the area. And, you know, internally there was a huge groan. And then I was like, no, that's really what, you know, we have to keep believing that for everybody who's trying to elevate these stories in respectful ways. I think it's important that we're trying to continue to co-collaborate. So very critical discussion with the reporter, and anticipating maybe an article that will come out again that will kind of highlight the needs, not just for here, but the historical lens and the complications across our province about the needs. So I really am hopeful that all of you can feel in some way to participate today. I appreciated the questions and answers, responses. I appreciated the person who really challenged the whole notions of resilience last week. So I want to talk a little bit more about that as we get into today's session. So let's see if I can find my screen, my presentation. Okay, I think we're there. So today, again, was kind of zeroing in a little bit more on skills and theoretical understanding. And as I had said to you, I'm kind of teaching my very first trauma-informed grief education virtually through kind of a pilot cohort. And we had the most interesting dialogue last week about kind of talking about where the Canadian resources are. And as I continued to work away, pulling all of this together, and I did put together a resource list at the end of this session today to make sure that I'm capturing all of the amazing work. But I was deeply moved by the amount of Canadian research that went into and that is available to us. And I really want to stop and acknowledge I often years ago kept talking about Australian research and the Australian work. And then I keep, the deeper dive I was doing, I thought, wow, look at the amazing work that's being done here. And that all of you are contributing to, whether you're working in a micro level with individuals, whether you're doing family and community support, or whether you are part of the advocacy and social justice movements of kind of moving trauma and grief forward. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. It was a really refreshing feeling actually to dive in. So today I want to pay tribute to a lot of amazing people in Canada who are elevating the cause. Oh, do we have? Oh, okay. There's a question there, but that one's for you, Ann. So we talked at the very beginning of this about how easy it is and how almost seductive it is to want to have a map. And I know as each of us sit in front of a person who is grieving or been impacted by a traumatic event, how much we need and want a map. But right now we're pulling back to really look at this from a Nova Scotia lens again and recognizing the complexities of our territory. And I think that's an important piece to continue on as we start to hone in more on the skills. I think that we're kind of in this fluid movement of understanding. And I hope today is really, again, recognizing the multiple and existing worldviews and how the necessity, as Ann had suggested, again, the importance of acknowledging the land, our rights here on this land and that lack thereof for so many people. But I think it's important that we're continuing to really explore the territory. As much as it's seductive to want to how to do this, I think it's important that we're understanding and maybe today recognizing how much unlearning we need to do as well to continue to step into trauma-informed grief literacy and support for people. So I come back to this slide and I want to stop and ask the question for people. While we're integrating, and I think about kind of breaking down the silos of our work. So integrating at a macro level, trying to understand all of the ways that trauma and grief are very difficult to talk about. And to come together. And as Tracy's saying, that many times we're forced to do this support off the side of our desk with multiple and varying needs. So if we stop and reflect at a macro level, how much integration is important. And I've had some really meaningful conversation, and I really appreciate the emails and conversations that have been coming in from many of you, the opportunity to meet new people with new positions in this province, and really looking at the integration of kind of how we're all standing in this. So if we were to take a moment, I would love to know in the chat, what is your profession? What brings you to this session about wanting to know more about trauma and grief? I think it's important that we start to name the intersecting point of where do you work? Where do you participate in this? So I would love just to open this up from a chat at a very macro level. Who are we as a group today?
So please put in the chat. Yeah, I see we have several counselors, EAL teachers, social workers, personal counselors, outreach workers, school social workers, psychologists, SchoolsPlus facilitators, palliative care, caseworkers, nurses, public health nurse, lots of social workers, of course. Awesome. Lots of mental health clinicians of different kinds, counselors, psychologists, parenting journey, home resource volunteer at hospice, care coordinator, parenting journey, home visitor, disability support program care coordinator, Afrocentric child welfare team, advanced care planning facilitator, spiritual health. So yeah, awesome. We've got a nice blend of people. Indigenous Service Canada. Yeah. Okay, awesome.
I think this is amazing to see the representation today of so many cross-sectorial. I was curious to hear kind of where you're from, so thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important that we're really looking at this from a broad spectrum right across the province and recognizing that there's some people participating today that aren't here in our province, and also want to welcome and include you in this conversation as well. To me, when we start thinking about integration, I think it's incredibly important that we're thinking about integration at a very macro lens. I think it's important that we're coming at this continually and trying to invest more and more of ourselves and our understanding around what anti-oppressive practice actually means and how we are striving to look at decolonizing this province and the work that we're doing. So that to me is a very continual commitment and movement that we're working and trying to strive about integrating all of our collective experiences into what does this territory need to look like. So today we may not have the answers, but I think today we really start to look at what are the deeper layering questions about how do we do this practice. So I appreciate that. Now, the next step when we get into kind of thinking about integrating, we talked a little bit about integrating from a community lens last week. We talked about integrating and why family-centered practices are so important. So I'm just wondering, does anyone have any reflections that they would like to share in the chat about the importance of kind of moving from our systems, wherever we're working, into more of that community? So the communities in which you represent, or you are very much proud to be part of, and I very much open that up to all kinds of community space. Do you think that there is a strong role for integrating trauma-informed grief awareness in the communities in which you live? And how do you think we're doing with that right now?
All right, so please put in the webinar chat. I'm going to read this out loud, and we may even take this little clip and use it as part of our advocacy day in March, working to advocate for dedicated funding for grief counseling as part and trauma counseling as part of our advocacy efforts for an improvement in our mental health services, because we should be offering, we're working on a big campaign. The World Health Organization says 10% of our healthcare budget ought to be dedicated to mental health. That would mean a 40% increase from what we currently have. And it speaks to how little is dedicated currently and how desperately this is needed. So yeah, everyone is saying that their organization's been hesitant to move forward with trauma-informed grief training for staff, which is very sad. So anything we can do to advocate, if you're interested in advocating, reach out to me, Saritsky at NSCSW.org. You see that there's a need for this. Forgotten mourners, not enough resources, certainly not mental health training that is multilingual. That is also very problematic. People say they're trauma informed, but that doesn't mean that they actually are. So some great comments going on in the chat for those of you joining us after the fact and just watching through YouTube. You are missing out on some great conversation in the chat. And yeah, students feel like they're not allowed to talk about what happened. That, you know, students pick up on a lot of comments. Grief and trauma is largely viewed as an individual or family issue. Again, this is a comment that we agree that is part of our advocacy strategy, is recognizing that colonialism is about individualism as opposed to collectivism. And the mental health services are currently designed in a way that focus on the individual, that don't recognize the larger social components. School staff also feel that they are not allowed to talk about it. That is, yeah. Serena, blessings to you for all of your advocacy. This is so vitally important and unacknowledged. Gender related in regards to acceptance of grief. That is also a very interesting topic that we could do 12 sessions on right there.
And thank you, because I think this is what's important, is that we have so many aspects of community, family, and all of the isms that are existing in our society right now, that I think that there deserves to be much more attention to each one of these intersecting aspects of our community and families. What's important to me, and I want to take it one step further, and is to suggest that it's more than grief counseling, more than trauma counseling is what we're looking for. I think it has to be a shift in practice before we get to problems, right? Before we pathologize and are looking for the counselors. To me, I think the advocacy needs to come around kind of how are we, collectively across all of our sectors, how are we making these dialogues accessible? How do we start to look at kind of the ways in which we can start to look at support and education, or education and support? So to actually think that it's just about creating more spaces for grief counseling, I think it's more than that. And I'm constantly really pushing back on that as being the one way forward. And I had that dialogue again with the reporter this weekend, because I think it's important. I think that really, it's like Tracy said at the beginning, grief belongs everywhere, but it really does require some attention, some skill sets, and really some unlearning of things that maybe we had learned. So I want to take us through a little bit of that, kind of where we have landed in 2022 with trying to understand, where does grief fit? I see this as probably and again, we talk, there's been lots of literature wrote about the whole effect of trauma and grief actually becoming a bit of an epidemic in our own country. And I think it's important that if we're not able to start to talk about it, but I think there's so much rich knowledge that can come from peer-led groups, but also kind of that supervisory and mentorship that we all require. This isn't just about learning some skill sets and going off on our way. It's really continuing to deconstruct, decolonize, really look at anti-oppressive practice. And I don't think that we can do that wholeheartedly and with good intentions unless we continue to keep coming together. So I think it's important that we think about integration in a way. So we look at macro, we look at meso level integration. And to me, it's telling our systems that we need time to integrate and digest this as practitioners. We need to make sure that it's not just good intentions that we're doing this work with, that it's really moving into something that's much more critical and needed in 2022 and moving forward. So what is our social legacy for the future? But again, I want to stop for a moment, and I want to really reflect also about the integration that each of you are doing as you have been shouldering, as Tracy says, the trauma and grief needs of a province that's really been brought to its knees in so many intersecting ways. How are you each doing again? And I want to really reflect back on that at a very micro level. There's the work we do with individuals, but what about our own personal integration of this work? And creating the space. For some people, we're coming into that narrowing down of the December 31st date. We're putting a close to 2022. How has this year felt for you? And I would really love some personal reflection on what has this year been like. Could you sum it up in a couple of words? Again, at a very personal, professional maybe. What has this year? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So integration to me is not just what's happening around us, but even more importantly, it's really reflecting on what's happening inside of us as well. So if a couple of people commenting exhausting, challenging, take a look at what our colleagues are saying. There's an important piece in doing this work. Thank you. The significance of creating spaces like this, I think, is important. And I appreciate people are talking about the isolation of this work, the heavy, the uncertain, the different intersecting ways that you are actually trying to do this work. overwhelming, so many different ways. I really appreciate that people are reflecting on this honestly, because to me, coming back to where we started on day one, I am forever the optimist that we need to break down doing this work solely on the sides of our desk into more dedicated and committed, proactive, preventative ways that we can actually be supporting people with their grief, including our own. And so much work is being done about the impacts, again, about care of the caregiver, but really it's how do we create open spaces for this that feel safe, that we can talk about the impacts that the work has on us as a community, as practitioners, and whatever the different varying roles that you all have. If we can't name the territory, how do we create the map? So thank you. Thank you for integrating this in all of the different ways. Thank you. Quality of life scale. And again, insight into the ways that we are looking at our own lives. And again, I don't know about you, but coming to the end of the month of December is often a very reflective time. As we connect to nature, we know winter has this thing, this process about us drawing inward. And I think it's important that we are really doing the reflection. So I appreciate the ProQuill naming tools that you use as well, about really being able to value kind of where am I in the spectrum of the work that I'm doing, the life that I'm living, and the private integration of what all this means in my own life. I think our own trauma-informed grief awareness is so critically important in this process. And as we move through society, as we move through our day-to-day, as we go to our grocery stores every day, wherever we're landing, I think at our workplaces, with the clients that you are supporting, with the families you are supporting, with the causes that you are supporting, and the advocacy and social justice, I think it's important when we come back to the trauma stewardship work. Very interesting when experiencing overwhelm and trauma. This is one of the things that Laura Lipinski, I keep forgetting how to pronounce her last name. I mean, this is a tool that really to look around. What do we see? We see a society, I mean, we pick up the news, we turn on the TV. I think there is a very big need, a very big outcry right now that I think there are so many intersecting ways that we ourselves, as well as society around us, is experiencing overwhelm and trauma. And I appreciate that, the reflection about the holidays. Maybe we knew that, but this year it's much more heartfelt that we understand that this is not often, and for many families, not considered a very positive time. So experiencing overwhelm and trauma, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work as well, but again, I start to think about like chronic exhaustion and saturated nervous systems, connecting so much with some of what you're actually saying here. There's the isolation. Sometimes there's the guilt and the fear. I had a moment this weekend of not really wanting to do the report, but I also knew that this is a very small window, again, of trying to keep elevating. So taking a break before we do these things, but I think it's so important that we're really looking at the amount of overwhelm. And as this year draws to a close, and as our sessions today draw to a close, I want to reflect back the deep work of that holding space for ourselves and being able to participate, I hope, in these kinds of sessions that really do reflect and honor the hard work that each of you have been doing. Oops. So again, by asking this question, how are we integrating the process of trauma and grief collectively? We know that we have many more strides to make, but I think, again, I'm always optimistic when I see people coming together, people willing to share, to be able to say, I know we can do this differently. So again, I want to also reflect back when we're working heavily every day in the micro, meso, and macro levels that we are very important in this picture as well. being able to take time, if you are so inclined to have some time off over the holiday, whatever that means for you, that I do wish each of you an opportunity for some self-reflection, for some rest, resting our nervous system, making space for some of our own processing of what this year has meant. I think those are important. And again, that critical reflection can be very, it can bring up a lot of those feelings of things that we have suppressed, the joy, the pain, all of those things. So I think I just wanted to acknowledge before we lean into this too much today, the absolute significance, importance, and the recognition for each of you. So as we're trying to figure out how to continue working with trauma-informed grief, and trying to break down all of the isms that are really, really getting in the way of the work we're doing. And I want to come back to Parker Palmer's comment that the human soul doesn't want to be advised, fixed, or saved. And I think there was a comment, kind of some of what we're doing sometimes may not be coming from the most informed place. And I appreciate that. It simply wants to be witnessed, to be seen, to be heard, and companioned exactly as it is. When we make that kind of deep vow to the soul of a suffering person, our respect reinforces the soul's healing resources, the only resources that can help the sufferer make it through. And I think it's important as we start to talk about this today, the significance of Parker Palmer's comment here, connecting again with the important work that Eduardo Duran is actually telling us about these soul wounds, and talking about this again from learning more about trauma-informed grief from an Indigenous and all of the values of Indigenous processing of grief and trauma. So important that we recognize the seen, the heard, and the companion exactly as it is, which is really difficult. And we're going to understand a little bit more about why is this so hard. So we talk about the fact, and I often remember somebody telling me that during an event in our life, one that's going to stimulate loss, trauma, it's so important that we think about it. And I pay tribute to a dear lady I met many years ago who talked to me about the fact that, she came in to see me for some support. And she said, I think there's something wrong, Serena. Every morning I get up and I read my partner's obituary out loud. I have a cup of coffee. It's almost become like a ritual. And so I get up, pour my coffee, and I read this obituary out loud. And so this person came to me again from a very problem-focused kind of thing, like they think there's something wrong with me. And yet really, when we talked about it and she kind of explained what this process, what was it doing for her, we quickly started to understand the very beginning of a processing for persons is often about trying to rationalize that this has really happened. So trying to integrate this process for her. And what I said to her is like, how long were you with your partner? And she said, I think it's, I don't know, maybe about 52 years. And so I held my hands up, 52 years to like 3 months. What is it maybe that we're expecting from ourselves? And so she talked to me about kind of the people around her and the ways that they were talking and trying to tell her to stop doing that. It was making them uncomfortable, and making all kinds of conclusions that she wasn't doing well. What I think is important as we're processing events in our life that stimulate trauma or loss is I think that there's a couple of things happening for us. And for those of you who dive much deeper into this work, and I think there's such rich, rich knowledge, I think it's important that we're stopping to think about the brain and what it's doing to help rationalize. The nervous system is such an intricate process, right? A fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And those intricate processes that our brains are going through and our whole nervous system to rewire and understand what is happening right now. The other part of this, I think that's so important that again, and I start to see with grieving people is that eventually on their own time, this starts to settle into maybe what I would call their heart space. So they will often talk now about a sadness or an understanding or a frustration that this person isn't coming back. or this situation that they've lived through has changed them. And I think we talked a little bit about Meredith Parfit's comment about living in the life one and the life two. And so when we really think about all of the work that our brains and our nervous systems are doing, as well as our heart space, I think it's important that we see that this is both an individual task, but it's also very much a social one. And I think that becomes a critical part of trying to companion or walk alongside or work with somebody who's been impacted by trauma or grief. That we're trying to figure out how to do this internally, but we're also, all of the social constructs that are out there about the ways that people are supposed to grieve. We know that we have a long way to go to start to shift the narrative, the expectations, the judgments, the shame, the guilt-inducing pieces of this, the positivity, the resilience. There's a lot of things from a socially constructed lens that I think impedes us trying to kind of work through these processes. So when we come back to starting to think, and I was really, again, such an important lens last week, we talked about kind of this whole idea of understanding resilience. And again, I think I kind of talked about the importance of looking at resilience through a couple of different lenses. One of them is this forced positivity or forced resilience that we put on people. And I really appreciated this quote that there's real research on the impact of optimism and engaging in gratitude, but brushing over the reality of painful experiences and forcing yourself or someone else to just choose happiness in these moments denies our humanness. And I think this is incredibly important when we were talking last week about all of the different communities in which we experience oppression, colonization, racism, homophobia, all of the different ways misogyny reveals itself. And I think, again, with this push for people to want others to be resilient. And I think about the fact, and I know one of you was commenting about not being able to talk about the mass casualty and kind of leaving us. And there was some really good article that was out that talks about kind of, you know, what happens in that silence? Are we becoming resilient or are we becoming dismissed? And I think it's an important piece that, again, while we may still express gratitude, and I had a manager I was working with who very much came from a gratitude lens, which I deeply appreciate and make space for in my life. But I said, you need to be super careful about imposing that, especially through a trauma lens that sometimes as people are working through, and we could add forgiveness into this discussion as well. We need to be careful about forcing these kinds of things on people who are trying to work through the process. And I come back to that beautiful TED Talk, if any of you have had the opportunity, The Danger of a Single Story. And it made me think about kind of where we can put gratitude, where we can put positivity, where we can put resilience. I think the thing is we have to be careful of creating a single story, creating the stereotype that is not necessarily true or untrue, but we have to be careful about the incompleteness of them. And I think it's important that as people are processing, as communities are processing, of people as again, at a macro level are processing, there can be room for pain, dismay in all of the process, but also some people also can find and do find their way through that from a resilience lens. So important to me that we're not forcing these things on others, which I see a lot in our society. A very finite and individual balance. Really appreciate that comment. So if we look at different aspects, and again, I wanted to bring a few models in, but not to kind of get lost in all the models. But I think, again, there's different models about kind of looking how we do work with people, and that looking at that cultural humility. And I often say cultural with a big C and a little c. So I think about the context of rural practice as a small c cultural humility. And one of the things I remember talking about during the public inquiry is, you know, how come you are not working with us? We are a rural context. Our resources are different than they would be in an urban center. But again, when we start to look at the impacts again of kind of how we're processing big C cultural humility, we still have a long way to go. So building the safety, transparency, and trustworthiness, the guiding principles of being trauma informed, but kind of how we get there is super important. What I loved from this quote from Sissy White is that it's not trauma informed if it's not informed by trauma survivors. And I thought that was really powerful and goes very much in line with nothing without about us without us. And although those may seem very much like platitudes these days, I think they're very critical in how we're moving forward to create spaces that actually do feel that they're psychologically safe, trauma informed, and very grief literate. So unless we have actually had this discussion with the people who have been most impacted, I'm not sure that it actually is trauma informed. Again, we talked a little bit, and I want to get into talking a bit about this from many of you on the call today, and want to be respectful that a lot of you do work with children. But I also want to remind you that a 70-year-old is also someone's child. So important that we're looking at adverse childhood experiences, again, not with an ageist lens, but really looking at the impacts across the lifespan of how we do work and support and understand these adverse childhood experiences are critically important if we are to look at moving any kind of integration anywhere. Want to recognize, again, the adverse childhood experiences, how we kind of lean in and work with this. So if we stopped and had a moment of thinking about how we value children in our society, I think we see the conflicts. I think we see kind of some of the major issues, I think, again, in society about a child's life, a child's death, a child's grief. Do you see that we value all aspects of children? And from an adverse childhood experience, if we know, and we've known about ACEs for a while, how do you think we're doing by actually taking that data and actually conceptualizing it and providing space that we are valuing children? And I'm asking this question on a broad context, not in the work that you're doing currently. Would you say that we're working in a preventative, proactive way with this knowledge? The impact of ACEs, they can and are lifelong. Thank you for that. We're very reactive. Thank you. And crisis driven, absolutely. So it's interesting when we come across research, the needs assessments again, and I'm going to kind of reflect on again some amazing research that's been done here, some work with local people talking about these assessments and the importance of kind of how people perceive and understand. So it's one thing that we're learning about ACEs, and yet, as Tracy's saying, why does it feel like we're still pushing the river to really try to understand how do we support children through their life, through their death, and through their grief? So there's a couple of things that I think it's important to talk about. I'm not sure if anyone on this call today has children or has children in their life that they love. And I've often seen it's been really a bit of a protection factor that for many parents along the way, I think it's been important that they've often talked about just not really having the tools to be able to talk to their kids about loss. And, you know, I keep coming back to whose responsibility is it? And I know for many of us, we say it's the system's responsibility, it's the family's responsibility, it's the community's responsibility. And I think we get lost in this. But I know, reflecting as a parent myself, I think it's important that as your children kind of come into the world, and I think we're taught at a very young age, or a very interesting age along the way, that for many of us, we're taught about kind of, you know, the pros and cons of smoking during pregnancy, the impacts of healthy diets, you know, car seats, how we feed our children, seat belts. I think we're taught very early on that our job as parents are often to protect our children. And therefore, to talk about the implications of ACEs, any adverse childhood experiences, I often wonder, have we given parents the narrative to be able to talk about the impacts? Last week, I shared with you the impact of a parent, being a parent myself, and kind of recognizing that we have entered into one of the ACEs through the divorce within our own family. But recognizing that I'm also putting my children, like part of my experience as a parent is kind of recognizing that, you know, grief does occur, loss does occur. And the fact is that being able to shelter them from the experience of their loss and their own personal experience is not helpful to them or for them as they move forward. So I think that there's this protection that I often will say that for a lot of people, that's probably a bit of the reason why we find it hard. Many people, Tracy and I have talked about, and for those of you in the Northern Zone, when we have a major public tragic event, where is the narrative to help support parents and how to age appropriately talk about what this has been like for them? And so for many of parents, they don't know, and we don't have really great experiences to be able to sit and say, these are some really important things to be able to talk to your kids about at an age appropriate level. I think, again, we want to protect them from violence, from the impacts of all things that we would just rather not talk to our children about. But we also recognize for so many children in our worlds that there is no protection factor and that there has been privilege. And I have, you know, I remember talking to a friend of mine who was probably in her 30s and said, you know, I don't think I've really ever experienced the death of anybody in my life. Now, although there are other losses that occurred, she had equated kind of the grief to death. And I think, you know, isn't it interesting that not everyone has the privilege of escaping ACEs? And I think it's so important when we think about kids who need added supports as they're going through these adverse childhood experiences, how to be able to narratively talk with families and bring back community and family-centered care to break down kind of the needs. And I think about people who have access to, you know, private counseling versus kind of what our public systems can. I think about caseloads and the impacts of trying to run around doing the best we can with what we have. But again, I think, again, when you talk about crisis driven, I mean, it's back to that whole adage about trying to figure out who do we try to rescue from the river versus going upstream to say, if we know about these ACEs, why is it that we can't be doing something differently about this? I'm trying to catch up here with all of the comments, and I really appreciate all the things you're sharing with your colleagues as well. So protection and privilege, and I've often talked, I mean, and again, seeing kind of how we're changing and evolving through COVID, I think has been important, that there's been more and more distancing, I think, from a lot of the rituals that, I mean, I was watching this change kind of in Western culture around rituals and practices. And for those of you on the call that work in palliative, we hear more and more from people about not wanting to have funeral services or those kinds of things. So again, I mean, I stop and I look at what we know about adverse childhood experiences, and then I flip that around to say, how much are we trying to protect? Who are we trying to protect? Who isn't getting any protection? And how are those things intersecting for us to try to figure out when we're sitting with a child, a youth who's 15 years old, a 40-year-old who's coming to us with significant substance abuse issues, who have only recognized now about ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, or for the 80-year-old that has just gone into long-term care and is really struggling with that challenge of kind of adjusting to that. So I think across the lifespan, how important is it for us to be able to have honest conversations? Now, this is one of the quotes I wanted to read to you today. I think this is an important one, and it actually came from Megan Devine. If someone truly wants to help you inside your grief, they have to be willing to hear what doesn't help. They have to be willing to feel the discomfort of not knowing what to say or how to say it. They have to be open to feedback. Otherwise, they really aren't interested in helping. They're interested in being seen as helpful. She says there's a big difference. I often say to people, I mean, I know last week I went to a funeral visitation, and I often think that if there's not butterflies in our stomach in the moment that we open that door to engage with a family who is grieving and been brought maybe to their knees, I think there's a humbleness to this, that it's not always about knowing the right things to say. We know that in the protection of some people and the lack of protection from other people, we have to be careful with what we're saying. Our words matter, our intentions matter, and this progressive knowledge that we all need to help really understand the privilege factors, I think are really important. Now, she goes on to say, which I really appreciate, that we're looking for progress, not perfection. And that to me is where grief narratives right now, I think we have to be able to say, I don't know what to say. And I think there's something to be said for that. Whether we're trying to be seen as being helpful, again, we come with good intentions. I think there's a deconstruction of kind of not knowing sometimes that there is intersecting anti-oppressive lens that needs to be addressed as we're moving through this. If I am working with a 15-year-old youth who has come into our grief groups, is that discussion potentially different? And I don't want to superimpose, but I also don't want to dismiss. So I think it's walking into this as openly as I possibly can. And the critical factor to me is the supervision that we have collectively together to help us to continue to keep moving forward in ways that are more helpful and less harmful. So I'm going to come back to understanding sometimes it's not what we say, but it's the environment in which we're creating that we're really looking deeper into the work that we're doing with people. So we remember that loss is guaranteed in life, but not all loss is equal, not all loss is just, and not all loss is fair. And we know that for every family that we're working with, we think about all of the different intersecting ways, and these are only a few. There's divorces, there's job losses, there's moving away. And I think about working with teams in Cape Breton, as we were talking at one time about the movement to Alberta, and and for people moving away and kind of what that was doing to family scenarios. And I thought, what a beautiful way to be able to talk about this. We know that illness affects families. And all kinds of illnesses. We talked about biases with all of these. We talk about moving and how much of a challenge that is, and for children that move between family to family, but for those grandparents that are caught up in those moves, and for the parents who are caught up in those moves. If we're thinking about separations and changes, we know that abuse definitely is a part of this process as well, and understanding that not all loss is equal, just, or fair. So I think it's important as we continue to keep moving along with, if a child, if an adolescent, if an adult sits in front of us, we know that they also carry loss that may not be equal, just, or fair. And so sometimes when people came to see me with a presenting grief experience, what I quickly found out was there was another grief that was bigger for them, hidden behind, but they were testing me to see if I was safe enough to talk about that one. And I think it's important, I draw to on Gabor Mate's work that, I mean, and he reminds me that children don't get traumatized because they get hurt. They get traumatized because they're alone with the hurt. And again, if I asked you the question about how old this child is, are they 6? Are they 16? Are they 36? I think this applies to people. People don't get traumatized because they get hurt. They get traumatized because they're alone with their hurt. And I think that's important as we're starting to shift our literacy and our listening. And I think it's, again, what do I feel safe enough to share with you? And what am I going to tuck away? Because I'm not quite sure if you're ready to hear the other parts of my story. Just want to check in. Just any kind of comments. Yes. Thank you to the person that said that the effects of the mass casualty when we were all stuck at home isolated. I also think about us, the unmarked graves during isolation. I think about the Black Lives Matters, the movements of so many tragic deaths again brought up that we really didn't think about the fact that so many people were isolated in so many ways. And again, at a macro, meso, and micro level. And were you going to say something?
No, when you were saying that you wanted to check in, I was getting ready to try to assist you in that.
Okay.
There's great conversation happening, and you are making a very good point, as is Lori. She says, so much happened when we couldn't get together to process.
Oh, we lost you, Anne.
No, I muted.
Oh, okay. So another, again, and I want to keep coming back to ACEs, but I think it's important that we start to think about models that we're working, that we can start to see about kind of being trauma unaware. And I'm not sure that the quality of this is fantastic, but I have included this in the resources. So again, I think about historical, collective, and personal traumas. And again, we react to the symptoms, and that means that we're trauma unaware. So the fact is that we're trying to rebuild this in a way that, again, is trauma aware, is trauma informed, is looking at kind of how are we working with some of those positive adverse childhood experiences? What are we doing to teach literacy? How are we, again, and I often say to people, it's very interesting, and I don't know if any of you are soccer parents. I'm going to just use soccer as an example. So if you are a parent who takes your child to learn how to play soccer and be part of a team, we know the significance and the importance. So I think if we look at the coach as an example, that what we're looking for in a soccer coach would maybe somebody who's out on the ground during practices, is teaching all of the great things about being in a team, about supporting one another, all of those great things about teaching the skills, the knowledge, the values of the game. I often think when it comes to trauma-informed and grief literacy, that's sometimes more of what people are looking for than really kind of looking for someone to fix it. What we're looking for are people who can kind of understand and teach us the knowledge, the skills, and really listen to what our values are. I think those kinds of things from a coaching lens, to me, go a lot further than trying to be that person who has all of the answers, because I know that's going to get me into trouble. So I think if we start to look at moving towards a just society, I really kind of appreciate it. And when I see kind of infographics that look like this, that we can start to work on and kind of understand where are we in the territory. So it brings me back to checking in on myself, you know, is what I'm doing trauma aware? Is it informed? Am I kind of looking towards moving and recognizing what I'm doing alongside an individual also is very much connected to the macro level, and whatever their lived experience might be, that helps them contribute to the narrative of their own stories. So again, this is at the end of it, you will get the resources. One thing I often like to come back, and I think that for some families, we have those opportunities in our life to start to talk about grief literacy. Not every family has this privilege, that some losses are not the big ones. So I often say that what we're doing constantly, you know, I was going to include this awful experience, but when my children were young, I bought them goldfish, and I can't believe we're recording this, but so I bought my children some goldfish at their request, and we jokingly were trying to come up with a great name for them, and I called them the Belly Up Boys, and the kids really liked that name. But unbeknownst to them, that we were starting to talk about the lifespan of those goldfish. And I don't want to minimize the significance of those goldfish or any other lived creature in our world. But what I did do is it allowed us an opportunity to start to talk about death, dying, and grief through a lens that I know that those skills needed to kind of be built on throughout life. When we don't make it onto the soccer team, and that was a really big dream of ours, there is loss. It allows us the opportunity to start the grief narrative and start to talk with our kids about what that experience. We think about breakups during youth, and again, how absolutely tragic those first breakups really are. This is an opportunity for us to continue to help support a grief narrative, because I think in life, we can guarantee that there is going to be more grief. And I've often said that in school presentations that I've done. Somewhere along the line, we decided to start teaching our kids about sex education because we knew that they probably were going to have sex. My question's always been, where are we teaching our kids about loss and grief and death? Because for some kids, there's going to be more of that than sex. And yet we haven't made space, again, collectively, to be able to talk and share and understand and listen to what kids' experiences are. And I know back, some of you have been co-facilitators of some of the youth groups that, and again, adult groups and children's groups that we've done through our pilot here in the Northern Zone. We used to always open up by having a conversation with especially the students about all of the things that people have said to you about your grief that weren't helpful. And we would get flip chart papers out where the youth were able to write whatever they wanted, and swearing was allowed. And it was really quite liberating for them to be able to understand. Again, it's not that people were ill-intentioned, but the fact is they were unaware of how to talk about grief. And so we would fill these flip chart papers with things that weren't helpful. And I think it's important that we would flip that around to start to look at what are some things that you need to hear. What are some things that you'd like to be able to talk about? Where does your grief show up? And I mean, it was not uncommon for students to be able to talk about, like, we don't know who to talk about to go help us buy a bra. You know, that was my mom's job, and she, you know, she's not here. So we heard in really tangible ways these kids were navigating themselves through these grief experiences without really having kind of the ability that maybe they didn't have those practice times to be able to talk about it before these big tragic lens grief experiences. And I also intersect this so much in the memoirs and the narratives we're hearing about intergenerational trauma and grief. And again, that narrative is so important that we're able to kind of connect those back in our own historic lens of kind of, we carry forward the grief of others before us. And I think it's important that these are opportunities that we can build upon. And again, I hope within the next 20 years, it will shift the narrative that grief literacy becomes more common at every level, at a micro level, at a meso level, and definitely at a macro level. The same, it was interesting. I was talking to a person who had experienced the death of their partner, and they had talked to me about it. And I thought this was so profound. They said, it's almost like I lost the other pillar. And they said, you know, those houses that had pillars in the porch, you know, and now one of the pillars are missing. And so when I hear people talk metaphorically, I think it's really important that we're hearing the significance in their stories, but also just how acutely are we listening and how are we building that? So when I'm often working with people and I'm catching myself, I have to be super careful of the questions that I'm asking people. Because if someone's telling me a story and I'm asking a question that's going to veer them off to the right when they want it to go to the left and tell me something else about their grief experience. So this is part of that. I think the significance of having kind of the supervision pieces of kind of how do we set together to say, you know, I said this and it didn't really feel that great. Does anyone else have a suggestion? So what I often believe is that in our ability to gain our knowledge and skills and really look at the values of grief, I think we need to have these peer groups, supervision groups behind us constantly being able to continue to talk about this so that it doesn't feel like it's just one of those things off the side of our desk. It becomes somewhat of a focus of our work. Everybody's groaning, saying, no, not another meeting. So leaning in a bit more Canadian research. And this is a beautiful article that I have recently read and have had the privilege of working alongside some of these folks. So they talk about the need for literacy and progress. And when they start to talk about this, they talk about the capacity to assess, process, and use knowledge regarding the experience of loss. It's important that the capacity is multidimensional. So I think that is a critical piece of this again. So it's not that for every 16-year-old that I get to use the same skill sets. It needs to be multidimensional. And it will comprise itself of the knowledge to facilitate understanding and reflection, skills to enable action, and values to inspire compassion and care. So these dimensions connect and integrate via the interdependence of individuals within sociocultural contexts. And I don't know about you. I don't know if you get as excited about grief as I do, but I think how wonderful to hear this. Interdependence versus this cone of silence. And I think it's so critical that we're pushing ourselves to say, really, it's not about going off in an isolated way and trying to cope with our grief. And I'm frankly quite tired of that. And that's why I want to break down that grief counseling is our only way to go. Because really what I want to see us do is to create these interdependence. I want us to be able to talk about this in communities of care and capacity to build this. So I think when we're starting to talk about the actual tools and techniques, I think really we have to remember that grief literacy is greater than the sum of its parts. And so it's not as important about the tools that we have in our toolbox as it is of really understanding and deconstructing the fact that we have to break down the isolation, the loneliness, the impacts of silence and stoicism that we've talked about. This to me is where we can start to flip this upside down and move forward. I really loved, and I think that it's coming up. I drew on an amazing presentation that I've also put into my resources, a presentation with the Canadian Association of Social Workers that was hosted on March 4th of 2021 by Nancy Ross, Elizabeth Perry, and Kevin Dugas. The benefits of incorporating an adverse childhood experience lens in social work practice. To me, so many nuggets came out of that intersected this well. And thinking about those ACEs, the adverse childhood experience assessments, and again, figuring out how do we use those in a knowledgeable way, because some people can find that information overwhelming. Some people find that very liberating. And how we're moving through this, I think, is really incredibly important. So I just want to remember that it's greater than the sum of its parts. So some important things that I like to try to consider is that I need to listen some more. And I need to be very conscientious. So we're going to be doing a bit of facilitation education in the new year and really trying to apply some of these practice skills, because I don't know, when I actually did some professional development thinking I was a really great listener, I really realized that this probably is a professional development tool that I could actually revisit frequently. to really understand the questions that I ask as an active listener. Sometimes we're veering people in directions that were more about me, the helper, than it was them wanting to tell me the story. So critical self-reflection to me is very important as we consider to be trauma-informed and grief-aware. I think we need to be honest. I think we need to dig into the things that we know little about and keep learning more. And I think that's a commitment to our own education. I think we need to answer our own, kind of thinking about our questions, but asking the questions of others and letting them answer. Considering our language, I mean, who has choice and control? We need to think about those things. Expectations, and the reminder that grief is felt physically, emotionally, financially, mentally, spiritually, and not getting caught up in maybe just the emotional lens, or sorry, the mental lens of grief. So we're going to come back to that. Again, the importance of the medicine wheel and what we're learning in hybrid ways of understanding Indigenous knowledge, how important this is to be very broad in our understanding and our growth. We really need to keep learning from one another. Oftentimes people will have a hard time bringing up, and again, when we come back to talking about even the mass casualty, so important that people continue to really not be sure where we're allowed to talk about that, because I think the narrative and the social construction is that we don't talk about it. And I think there's been an impact to that. So again, we need to be able to name a person's name. We need to be able to name an issue that, again, in a sensitive way, in an understanding that it's, you know, I think about that whole thought about it almost needs to become mentionable before it's going to become manageable. But again, how we mention it matters. And again, and I'm just drawing on the lens of vicarious trauma. I think, again, we go through this public inquiry and we start to really look at the issue has been raised, but has it been raised in a way with intentionality around the impacts of the trauma and grief? So being actively present, which I think is one of the hardest things of all of this list, in the land of multitasking, I think that has become probably one of our biggest barriers. And we've been having some talk in our class about this, about being present is probably one of the hardest things that we're seeing folks being able to do right now. Know that there's nothing to fix. It's not our job. And again, when we come back to the damage that we might be creating in this by trying to fix. I often say, if we come back to those kind of moving through the pendulum of kind of the intuitive and the instrumental styles of grief, I always reinforce that it's not my job to push or pull people to one side or the other, that flow is their flow, and we need to respect that. We need to understand that an instrumental style of griever may not have had the environment, the people, the supports internally or externally to be able to delve into some of the intuitive pieces, the emotional pieces of their grief. Likewise, those people who are deeply in the intuitive aspects of their grief may not have the internal, external resources to help guide them more, again, into some of that other side of the instrumental grief. So I always want to come back that in our language, in our nonverbals, where we have to be really cognizant of the fact if we're pushing or pulling. And I think about if we're kind of co-facilitating groups, these are the important pieces to me that really help us behind the scenes, because I often think what's happening behind the scenes is equally as important as what's happening during a group. Are we able to critically talk with one another about the fact that, you know, I did notice that maybe that you were pushing someone? Can we talk about that? And again, I think that these are important as we're continuing to work on our own skill sets and values and what we're bringing to the table. I think within grief, we look at the challenges. We also look at the strengths that people bring, and I think it's working with them. And again, who else is in need of support? So again, from a family lens, very interesting that we can be working with a child or one person, but recognizing that they also belong to a greater network. And does that network also require some education and support? Are they open to those things? And is that within our purview of helping to support a family-centered lens? be cognizant of guilt and shame. I think those things are really important when we're thinking about doing or when we're in the midst of doing work. And I think it can be very subtle. So some of those microaggressions that will really bring up a lot of guilt and shame that either doesn't come up or gets very much internalized as a more oppressive nature. And again, another thing about, am I protecting and is that helping? And so when we come back to thinking about the mass casualty, again, we had a very difficult time. And again, I still bump into families that ask about this. Like, I don't know, my kids are still asking questions. And again, we have to think about that kind of, you know, the nuances of trying to protect or trying to educate. And how are we going to do this in ways that, again, is responsive, supportive, and not creating more vicarious trauma? The important part as well, are you committed to your own sense of being anti-oppressive and in decolonizing in your practices and your values and your learning? And for me, I continue to keep delving into this more and more, and I start learning that I know little and little. And I think that's my commitment, that this is a lifelong process of really helping to understand myself and people around me about what else we need to be doing from a trauma and grief lens. To improve the narratives, whose voices are not being heard. And again, that's why I find forums like this challenging, when I don't want to be the dominant voice. So I'm so appreciative that everyone's kind of contributing and collaborating in this the best way we can. And I think, again, there's so many resources and guides in the land of self-help out there. And I'm often cautious about kind of how we're trying to support people. And trying to find resources that are, again, driven by the person and their needs and values. Anything that we'd like to talk about at this point? And is there,
there's some, of course, great comments in the chat. Martha just said, giving ourselves permission to be actively present to one thing at a time, or being kind to ourselves when we can't. So I think we're all just sort of translating your wisdom into the parts of our life that are in need of it.
Thank you. And so I want to do a little bit of kind of just wanted to kind of do a little bit of an overview, and we'll keep this brief because this could be the part that puts everybody kind of to sleep, but I wasn't sure whether to include it or not. Back to that history teacher of mine that I talked about. And I often think back now, when I did my BA, I did a double major in sociology and history. Now, when I think about the context of the history that I didn't learn, it's really put me on a path of continuing to understand more about history and colonization and deconstructing what I thought I knew. But I think it's so important that the historical context to our grief theories, and kind of that their roots of the present do lie deep in the past. And I think it's important when we think about all the social discourses of the worlds in which we live, and how really we've kind of put and pathologized and medicalized death, but really starting to think about kind of how have we landed where we've landed. And we know that the impacts were massive for North America in its entirety, in Turtle Island. So I often, when I go back to start to deconstruct and understand a little bit about where grief and its theories started to emerge from, I'm really fascinated by this. And I think if we take our first step in understanding colonization as being the most significant part of our history, that we have so much more learning to do. I think about white settlers who came to this country and how they changed everything. And I think now, as we're pulling apart and trying to understand more and more and more about the effects of colonization on our Indigenous communities, our land, and kind of how we're all trying to move forward in a way that is truly embedded in truth and reconciliation, not just the theory of it, but actually conceptualizing and practicing it. So I think as time has gone on since this land again existed, and then the settlers came, and then I think about as we kind of went along, and I think about from a white settler's Western lens, I think about deaths that occurred, and I think, you know, Indigenous communities and families had such rich rituals, knowledge, understandings, and connection to grief and death. And then I think as the white settlers come into, and we'll use Nova Scotia, and we think about, for many people from a Western lens, we think about people who immigrated, who, again, when they found out that extended family members died, just for instance, we'll use Scotland. For many people here, they were unable to cross the ocean again, to actually participate in those rituals. And I often think about, why is it that North America has been considered this dying phobic, grief phobic culture? And I think, you know, it's not, and that's the thing that I'm learning more and more, is that it isn't in its entirety. It's just that we have to learn more worldviews, and we can't just subscribe to a Western culture approach. So when I think about the fact that it became very conflicted again, as people settled here, then I start to think about the impacts of World War I and World War II that again happened across the ocean, where we didn't get to see or participate in that in the same way that people in Europe did. So again, I think that changed a lot of things when we go through big experiences of death and dying. And I think at that point, when we started to look at the institutionalization of dying, so after the wars and into the, you know, the 50s and 60s, we started to see death dying happen more in hospital settings. And that would be the birthplace of Kubler-Ross, again, pioneer that I always pay credit to, who has taught us a lot and put this on a radar for us in a different way. But I think what happened was we started to really medicalize, and we started to look at the seductiveness of the stages. And we talked about that last week. So grief started to be looked at through a mental health lens. And I think it changed things when we started to look at kind of the pharmacological impacts. We started to think about the counseling impacts. And we started to really medicalize in a Western lens what grieving actually looks like and how we treat it. I think then we move into kind of looking at kind of the importance and the significance of funeral home industry that started to happen, and how we started to kind of remove it from a family community centered base, and we started to look at someone else to start to do the work of the death trade. And caregiving as well. We see institutional care starts to happen more with long-term care settings. And again, that's where we start to also see a lot of that youth perpetuating industries, that we're never going to have to die if we buy the right skin cream, right? And then the pharmacological business, I think, started to change. So I think when that's just a quick snapshot of what some of the, and I tend to get into some of more details around these, but I think we have to recognize that the practice, every one of us, whether it's working in a school or if it's working beside someone who is about to die in the community, in the hospital, in a long-term care setting, I think it's important to know that this knowledge has emerged from this political context. So we've been through a lot of events since the world began. And I think it really has pulled us further away in some ways. And we're sitting in this place right now through a pandemic, trying to understand what is the political context of how we are doing death, dying, and grief. So if we go back and pay some credit, and again, I'm not going to get into a lot of this. I think we go back into 1917, we think about Sigmund Freud and all he had to teach us. I often think with Sigmund Freud, good thing we've had him, good thing we're moving on. But this was some of the language that we started to hear. So you can read that. And then in 1944, we start to look at Linderman, and they talk about normal mourning and how we look at shock and disbelief and acute mourning and resolution of the grief process. And in the 1960s, we had Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who started to talk about the stages of dying, which got kind of pulled into the stages of grief. And again, I see this model still widely quoted, not just quoted, but still kind of in quite an action phase throughout Nova Scotia. So that's where we start to hear language around denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Most all of that language is language that I have taken out of my grief literacy backpack. I really don't subscribe to this being kind of in a stage by stage. And I worry about the terms about denial. I often say, Tracy, if I think you're in denial, there's not any way that I can be saying that I'm not kind of imparting some kind of judgment in the way you're doing things. So I often say, instead of denial, what if it's people are doing the best they can with what they have in the moment? And that's not about denial. It's just the fact that they can't take in the breadth of it. I think about kind of our anger management world, where we're often told to kind of suppress or change or do something different with our anger, which again, anger to me is a very healthy part of our grief experience and kind of how we're navigating this. And not to say that she's suggesting it's a negative, but I really struggle with us getting into this positive, negative emotions with grief. I think we're meant to feel all of these. And we talk a little bit about the numbing of those, and you can't kind of selectively numb one and not numb all of it. So when we talk about being trauma informed and we talk about grief, it's really having access to all of the emotions that we're really entitled and part of, being human. Bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I've had a lot of people who've come into my office over the years and have actually unloaded some pill bottles talking about them not being helpful. And I've often asked the question, what is it that you're trying to treat? And let's talk about that. Is it depression? Is it grief? Is it anxiety? Is it fear? And how much of this is socially constructed that we don't really get to talk about what this experience of grief and bereavement and trauma actually is. So I think it's important that we use language, we pull on language, but again, to really step into what trauma and grief is, I think it's really, again, coming back to what that lived experience is for people and kind of, looking at ways that we don't intentionally, but we can be pathologizing and medicalizing grief experience for people. So also, I always move away from some of the language around closure. I've had lots of discussions with lots of palliative care folks and constantly saying, like, let's not encourage people to go to a funeral or a service to get closure, because we know really that closure doesn't exist. There really isn't an end. And I think that's the thing that we're often to help normalize this process for people. It's really to understand that if you've loved an experience, a person, a place, a thing, once you've experienced the loss, that's still part of who you are, and that you don't, the relationship changes. But I often think closure has caused us a bit of dismay. I often hear from people around some of the mass public events, again, when are people going to get over it? And to me, that comes from some of that language around closure, that we're expecting people to kind of get to some place that they're going to get over it. And I often say to people, there's no getting over this. There's no getting under it. There's no getting around it. Truly, the only way that we can experience these events in our life are really to kind of go through them. And again, that interdependence of meeting other people that help us co-regulate, that help us try to help make sense of this. And I think those are important narratives that are all part of this. So while I credit these people who have come before us, I think it's also really important that we're conscientious about how we're using grief theories and kind of what's kind of the impact behind some of the language. So Bowlby and Parks, they come up again with phases of numbness, yearning and searching, disorganization and despair, and reorganization. Warden came in the 1980s as well with the tasks of grief, and Therese Rando is another person who talked about the R's, like they recognize, recollect, re-experience, relinquish, readjust, and reinvent. So I'm not discrediting any of these grief theories. I think many of you may call upon and work with certain parts of these, but what I often say in the land of grief literacy and really looking at the social constructs in an anti-oppressive lens, I think we need to be conscientious of how we're using some of these narratives and who may be being excluded from some of these as well. So here we are in 2022, and somebody mentioned this, I think maybe on the first week, about the challenges that we're in right now. And I think I told you my kind of life dream before I die. I struggle kind of with all of this language now, and we talk about complicated grief, and I often push back to say, is it complicated grief, or are there so many socially constructed ways that we are complicating grief? And I think it's important that we're constantly holding these two things up to the light, because I really worry about us adding more diagnosis about the ways that we are navigating this land, this territory, without really clear understandings, historical, indigenous, culturally represented. What is complicated grief? And I just really haven't bought into kind of the ways that we've pathologized people's grief as not being a complicating factor. And so these things are important I know when we started at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was asked to be part of, with the Nova Scotia Health team, ways to kind of help educate and support people, because we knew all this complex grief was coming down the pipes. And then we started using terms around delayed grief and all of those things. And I think here we are in 2022, and I think we have to kind of keep peeling away the veils of what does this mean? And how are we kind of inserting that diagnosis, and kind of who's policing those borders of what is complicated versus how have we complicated this? So that to me would be a whole other wonderful series that we could do. Another person I wanted to kind of bring in, so some highlighted thoughts, Stephen Jenkinson, again, another Canadian. Again, some of you may follow Stephen's work. Some of it is like, he's just been, again, a mentor in my life that's really made me think and reflect a lot more deeply. So I wanted to just put some of his reflections on his book, Dying Wise, if you've had an opportunity to read it. So his website is Orphan Wisdom, but I think when he thinks, like, some of the reflections about dying wise, it's a right of everyone. It's a shared responsibility that binds us all. So when we start to think about complicated grief versus, this is a right of everyone and a shared responsibility, they seem to be a bit in contrast. He talks about this being a moral obligation that we're binding living and dying people and those to come in the future. He talks about it being a political act, one enduring place where we can declare what and who we are willing to be with one another. It's an act of love, a way you could be known by those you won't live long enough to meet, the way by which they may feel loved by you after you die. And I think that comes back to the legacy work, which, again, we think about legacy, and again, from a Western lens, that might be about, what you've got left in your bank account and how many RRSPs you've left for your loved ones. But I think it's so much more important. And if we lean on Indigenous theories about the 7 generations behind and ahead of us, I think it's important that what is our legacy? Who are we? What values? What knowledge have we passed along? And I think it's important that if we are to keep grief as a badge of honor, which truly I believe it is, because I really do believe grief is that way in society, and one of the very few ways that we actually express something or someone or something that has been really meaningful to us. And I really appreciate Stephen's reflection of this. He calls it spiritual activism. He says it's immensely hard labor in a time and place that death-phobic and grief, and we're death-phobic and grief illiterate. And he's generalizing here. He says it's also a subversive Trojan horse kind of deed, and it binds you to your people, to your ancestry, and to those who will come after you. So again, just looking at some different reflections. So again, we look at grief theories versus we start to look at this expansive knowledge about multiple worldviews about how we do approach death or grief, trauma, as we move forward. So I think, again, we can look about this being a group of fish in an aquarium, unaware of the water, or we can start to become very aware of the water and aware of our environment and aware of our history and aware of kind of looking at how do we deconstruct everything that doesn't fit for us anymore, about really truly becoming trauma informed and grief literate and supportive in our society. So I think I had mentioned before about kind of the fish swimming in the water and not even thinking about the trauma and grief around us versus what if we were awakened to it and understood it, and not feeling that we're working from the side of our desk, but really starting to engage in ways that we know that this can help so many of the different aspects of our social emotional learning, of our dying processes, of our work in substance abuse and mental health. What if this actually came in sharper focus and started to be a more proactive, preventative way in which we're supporting people? So again, there's so many, I could have went on and on and on, but recently I just was, moved by some of what I'm starting to see. I've been, again, really touched by kind of transitions that I see in society. I was part of this through the public inquiry. And again, the bereavement charter for Scotland, I was just thinking how wonderful to have a bereavement charter. And just what it is really recognizing. And again, when you want to look into this, but I also remember being in Germany at a conference a few years ago, and I snuck into a meeting with European social workers and asked them if it would be okay if I joined from Canada. And luckily there was another Canadian there, but I was so taken by this Danish social worker who was talking about the fact that every child up to the age of 16 had free access to any grief support they needed. It was always made available to them. And I honestly was sitting there in shock, and I said, you actually do that? And so what I do sometimes when I need to be inspired is I look around. And I know that other people, again, when we come back, and I will never subscribe to the fact we just didn't know what to do because it's never happened here. That's not okay, because evidence-informed practice and knowledge and multiple worldviews have taught us a lot about what happens everywhere. And some places are actually paving the way. And some of us are really trying to kind of help do the heavy lifting to make sure that our country, our province, our communities, our families, and within ourselves are trying to do the work of integrating and kind of advocating to what can be different. So this is one example. Also here in Canada, for those of you who are not familiar, there is a Canadian Grief Alliance. I'm proud to be part of it. Again, it's a group of people. Our mission has been to encourage the government to adopt a proposal to address national gaps in grief services that are leaving hurting Canadians unsupported in their grief. I love seeing all the wows. So again, through the Canadian Virtual Hospice, please take a look at some point at the Canadian Grief Alliance. Nova Scotia, I was proud that we had our very first provincial grief coordinator. It was an honor to sit in that seat. That to me should not have been a term position. So again, these are ways that we can elevate, but there are also ways that we have to be very cognizant that this is not an on the side, off the side of your desk kind of role. How do we help really embed and integrate? Very important that we integrate for all Canadians. I often say, and there was a video years ago that I did nationally that said, I believe we live in a highly resourced country. And I think it's, again, where are we putting our attention to? So if we think about back to the impacts of the medicine wheel, I think very important is we continue to keep leaning on and understanding multiple worldviews. I think about, now I'm going to talk about the end of 2022, and for all of you who may decide to have all of those New Year's resolutions, which I'm not even going to pretend I'm going to go to the gym, but I think about muscle memory. And I think about what we start to learn and lean and understand and kind of how we're moving. And I think, when we go back to integrating our heart and our head, I think it's important that Duran talks about the fact that we're really good at psychologizing grief and trauma, but how are we about spiritually and doing the soul work? So when we look at this, and again, I just am incorporating this for purposes of understanding and highly respecting the medicine wheel as a very pivotal part of my learning, my understanding, and my growth for holistic practice. I often think that we've looked at the physicality and probably some of the mental health of grief and trauma. The two aspects that I'm constantly working with teams and with individuals is how are we doing on an emotional and a spiritual lens? So when we're talking about integrating, and when I do a lot of my own trauma work, my person that I work with, she says, I think you're intellectualizing that again, Serena. And I'm like, oh, thank you. Like, thank you for that reminder, right? Because it's really easy and it's seductive to get into those places that we're, trying to write about it, trying to analyze it, but what are we feeling? And I think, again, this is where we're building our own muscle memory and starting to understand there's a different way to look at this. And I really appreciate Duran's knowledge about this being a soul wound, that trauma can be viewed through a wound of a soul. And so I'm reminded to get out of my head, not stay out of my head, because I'm paying much more attention to my own nervous system and what it's teaching me. So somatically, I am absolutely loving the knowledge and the values and the skills of understanding what my own body's telling me and really trying to pay attention to listening to that. But I also think as we sink into some more of that soul wound, I think it's important that it's a reminder that while we're constantly learning, I think there's a big part of what we're unlearning. And I think letting some of those expectations of the social constructs of grief and trauma go and really starting to lean into the anti-oppressive, true decolonizing, like what is it that muscle memory is teaching us? And how do we almost retrain ourselves to start to look at grief and trauma through a more spiritual and emotional lens? And how might that help us in the future? So one of the other resources that I draw upon, and she talks about kind of working from a strengths-oriented practice. She also talks about a spiritually sensitive practice. And she talks about these 5 values being important. And I just wanted to put these up as an opportunity because she's also talking, not she, they are talking openly about being co-collaborators, co-creators, and co-authors in the process of trauma and grief. So valuing clarity and ongoing self-reflectivity with an intent of self-growth and deeper understanding. And if there's anything that I hope the last 3 weeks have been, is this opportunity for us to stop and self-reflect together. I really, truly wish we were in a room together, but I hope that there's been an opportunity for us to do some self-reflection and just allowing ourselves to kind of have a bit of a deeper understanding for trauma-informed grief practices. Respect and affirming the inherent dignity and worth of others, but also recognizing person's spiritual, their practices, their beliefs, their essence, and their right to spiritual transcendence. This to me is the most beautiful part of looking at a strengths-based theoretical context, but also kind of incorporating existential theories. I truly believe, and I lean on Viktor Frankl and many people that have helped to form existential therapy to think about, we can't take away what people's lived experience and how they're transcending. It's more than resilience. It's really understanding how do people make purpose or meaning, more meaning, I want to say meaning of these experiences that they've had. And I need to respect that. Client-centeredness that's inclusive of cultural and spiritual context. So I think I may be being very client-centered, but if I'm not able to really bring in that spiritual aspect of holistic care, of understanding people's values and need for kind of how they seek peace, what they believe in. And someone was telling me the other day about attending a conference or a talk, I guess, about kind of the expansiveness of our province around newcomers. And I think if there's ever a time that we should have many years ago, but need to more now than ever, be understanding of cultural and spiritual context. It's not enough to have people coming from a labor economic lens. It really is about how are we going to grow and change and evolve as a province, as a country. knowing that people are coming to us with their own trauma and grief experiences, and that we need to keep that very much in mind, and very much in heart of understanding kind of how we are all going to collectively learn from one another and expand our worldviews. Inclusivity involves appreciating and advocating. I continue to say it's not okay just to have Christian-based holiday decorations and understandings. How are we really moving into appreciating and advocating for more inclusivity and freedoms and expressions, and really understanding self-transcendence and determination? This is part of where our society can go, and we can reconstruct this socially constructed view. To me, it's also bringing in the creativity and have the capacity for true resilience. And I don't know about you, but 2022 has been this incredible year of a lot of pain, a lot of growth, and a lot of memoir reading. And I am constantly in awe of people's capacity to find meaning, purpose, and understanding of their own lived experience. So again, coming back to, is it trauma informed if we haven't asked the people who've been most affected by the trauma? I'm not convinced. So reading first person narratives has been a very much part of my own professional and personal development, and understanding so many multiple and intersecting ways that people are living through experiences and teaching us. So to me, this links us back to really thinking about a lot of what I've come through with Australian research about the need for us to create compassionate communities, that we are co-collaborating, we're co-creating and co-authoring this whole process. I think it's an opportunity for us to really grow, and that trauma-informed and trauma awareness could actually make us a much more vibrant and sensitive environment. So again, applying a trauma-informed death grief literacy through a community development framework, which is really important. I mean, how are we intersecting with our knowledge, our skills, our experiential learning, and again, moving this through a social action lens? Guiding principles, for those of you who haven't, we talk a lot about trauma-informed coming from, again, an important, not just theory, but again, how are we conceptualizing these? You know, safety isn't just about one type of safety. I think it's so much deeper. And again, I come back to that quote about silence. And safety really is challenging the dominant voices to make sure that everyone's feeling psychologically safe in their families, in their workplaces, in their communities. So ensuring that we are embracing and understanding more and more about what psychological safety means everywhere. It's about really leaning in to understand about choices and control and sharing power in a way that maybe our systems have not provided that opportunity in the past. It's about making decisions and sharing this power and really truly being collaborative and building trust. And I think that's a critical part of the work that we do to move forward, especially with grief and trauma. So I just include that as, again, a model to be, for those of you who may not have seen that, but kind of want to kind of land and be conscientious of having some time for some open dialogue. And I really loved that one of you had said, you know, it can be thoughts and prayers and policy and change. So I appreciate that reflection as well. And I can't say thank you enough for the opportunity to be part of this, I don't know, this deep dive, I guess, over the last 3 weeks together. I deeply applaud for all of you in the middle of December on a Monday. You've been able to join in, but not just join in, you've been able to actively participate in ways that I can't say thank you enough. This has been a true privilege to be part of this. And I hope there's some nuggets that you take away, but I also want to recognize, as we're drawing 2022 to a close in the next couple of weeks, to allow space for all of the things, for peace, for emotions, all of the emotions, for a mental health break that you may need desperately, for the physicality, for all of the things on the medicine wheel, and learning and leaning into more of what we need as holistic practitioners and people. Thank you for all of this. And I just want to open this up if people want to talk anymore, or if you need a half hour of some breathing space.
No, 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 no. No breathing allowed. So a lot of wonderful comments. First of all, hopefully you're picking up on all the hearts and emojis and everything that's saying thank you. So you were talking about how trauma is a spiritual wound. As someone who is not only a social worker, but a board certified interfaith chaplain, I am delighted about this. My doctorate in pastoral counseling, I am very passionate about it. And Sarah Scott has asked to speak as a spiritual health clinician. And I think it's so important for social workers to connect with people who have done profound, deep training in spirituality and spiritual counseling when we talk about this, so that we don't cause harm, but we partner with those who have experts. So Sarah, I'm going to let you talk if you don't mind. All right, I've unmuted you, I think.
Hello, I'm here. I don't know that I have a strong comment that I needed to make. It was more of an echoing and amen to all of the importance of including spiritual health in alongside of the psychosocial support. So I felt very affirmed being a part of a social worker community, but having that aspect of spiritual health be welcomed and affirmed. So it was more of a thank you than a pressing need for a comment.
Okay, well, I apologize. I'd love to have you maybe connect with me. I'll send my email, not just you, but anyone else who's interested in this work, turning this educational session into advocacy, as the government is in the process of rethinking how mental health and healthcare happens, so that we can move towards this decolonized approach to healthcare that is integrated and collaborative and interdisciplinary, instead of these false boundaries and binaries like heart, mind, spirit, like those are separate somehow. Serena, do you have any comments around collaborating with spiritual care perhaps, or experiences in collaborating with chaplains or spiritual care practitioners in?
Actually, when I did my Bachelor of Social Work degree, I was intentional about going to St. Thomas University because they incorporated spirituality and social work. That was an incredibly important piece of the work. And I feel that's probably been a bit of a gap, because I've had the privilege of working alongside palliative care, and sometimes not just from deaths that are planned. As we start to look at medical assistance and dying and other ways that people die, I think it's really important that we're coming through this from a lens that we're bringing spirituality more to the forefront. So I often will say how important it is to work truly from an interdisciplinary model. Not sure that we're quite there. As you're saying, we have a long way to go around kind of the medicalization of all of this, but I think it's very much an important part from the lens of grief and trauma, which I really appreciated. It was such a really, and I would encourage anyone to pick up this book by Eduardo Duran, who talks about this from a soul wound, and the Indigenous knowledge and values of how we are going to move together with multiple worldviews and making accessible kind of how we do the work with trauma and grief.
Thank you. And I see that Lyndon Hardy from Hospice Halifax suggests Callahan's Spirituality and Hospice Social Work. And indeed, hospice and palliative care is really an interdisciplinary, person-centered, community-focused approach to healing. And Nova Scotia has a lot of work that still needs to be done around catching up with other places around the world when it comes to grief. So, oh, there we go. A couple of other fellow spiritual care practitioners. I heard also some people referencing earlier about Heather Boynton, who is the president of the Canadian Association of Spirituality and Social Work. And I do want to take this opportunity to say that there will be an international conference on the integration of spirituality and social work at Dalhousie, and I'm thinking that perhaps we need a panel or some kind of event on grief and spirituality and trauma and social work. So that is a little bit of an invitation if people want to do that. Yeah, EMDR has a group for spiritual practitioners as well. It's going to be in June, the conference on spirituality and social work at Dalhousie. I see that Kristen and Shay have turned on their cameras, so I'm thinking that perhaps they have a few comments that they would like to make as well.
Yeah, and thanks so much. I was just kind of reflecting, and don't mind the kiddos are coming back from recess, which is a really nice kind of review around the kids and listening to their joy as they transition back into classes. So it will quiet down here in a minute. I was thinking a lot about my own journey as a clinical social worker and my original kind of lessons around stages of grief and my own ignorance around, and some of the early lessons that I learned around trying to fit clients into stages instead of hearing and sitting with and understanding what they were trying to tell me instead of me trying to fit them into what I knew. And over the last 3 weeks, this has really kind of highlighted for me actually in terms of sitting with, being with, reflecting on, and then of course taking those and learning so much from our Indigenous practitioners and ways of knowing and learning. So over the last 3 weeks has been a true privilege and a very busy time to be able to take this this opportunity to sit and learn and reflect and then think about how we're going to move it forward. So in my world, it's that dialect around being in this moment, catching myself thinking about where we need to go moving forward, and then bringing myself back to the moment to be like, stay here, just sit. I'm going to flip it back over to Tracy to see if she has any words, and then I'm just monitoring the chat as well.
No, I just wanted to say thanks once again. Every time I do these with Serena, it reinvigorates my soul, reinvigorates my passion for the work, and it helps with so much personal reflection about, again, where we are, where we're trying to get to, and just the knowledge that you bring is amazing. And so I thank you for continuing.
All right, so any other comments or questions? Abundant gratitude to Kristen, Tracy, Danielle, Jolene, all of the different people who put together this vision, the grant, reached out to us, which is also a reminder to y'all that we are always here, the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, to support the kind of work that is desperately needed within Mi'kma'ki and beyond. And words cannot begin to express our gratitude to you, Serena, for all that you are, all that you do, for the ways that you stand firm in a world where everyone is trying to pull the blanket from under you, or the, I don't know, carpet from under you, and from under all of us, remaining firm in your resolve that grief counseling is needed, is everyone's right, is absolutely missing. Trauma support is absolutely missing, absolutely needs to be part of what we're doing. And it was encouraging to see that that declaration. And I am going to say right now in front of all of you and on recording that I want to advocate for this with all of you as someone who was one of 2 Spanish-speaking chaplains working in New York City after September 11th. I am personally deeply, powerfully committed to this work, and I am more than honored to join you all in advocating for this, because it's not even us advocating, right? It's what this land and its people need and deserve, and what has been withheld from us for far too long, and that only perpetuates more trauma. So Serena, I hope you're drinking in all of the love that's coming in, both through the chat and through the emojis, and hopefully we will have opportunities to continue to learn from you, work with you, and advocate with you for a healthier community for us all.
Thank you.
And with that, I am going to stop recording.